Okay, so thank you very much, first of all, for coming over from the States. And let's go a little bit into the past and ask, you come from a shipping family, private shipping company. Was it always going to be shipping, or did you ever consider doing anything else 2 or 3 decades ago?
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Kevin, for inviting me back. It's good to speak at Marine Money Conference again and see a lot of familiar friends and faces in the room. The short answer is, my background, for those of you that don't know, is somewhat one of both worlds, of 2 worlds. I come from actually 2 shipping families, 5 generations on one side and 3 on the other. Okay. But I was a born and raised New Yorker. Grew up in Manhattan my whole life. Formed some very strong friendships and bonds in the financial capital of the world, New York City. So I was both, as a child, going on ships. I ended up sailing on ships, doing disbursements accounts for those of you who may have done that or know how tedious that is, and learned the business from the bottom up, but also spent time forming some very strong bonds on Wall Street. And I was able to, as some of you may know, and I'm sure we'll discuss, form a marriage between shipping and institutional capital, which I always saw as a very obvious path for shipping.
Okay, thank you. And so, like we say, from 1989 to 2004 or thereabouts, you worked in the family business, and then you established Eagle Bulk, actually, which still exists today, a very successful company. So what prompted the move from the private family business into the opportunity with Eagle Bulk?
So a little bit like I just said, and maybe it's a factor of being in New York, but also being in shipping. To me, it was almost a foregone conclusion. I didn't know exactly when, but that there was going to be a marriage of traditional shipping with institutional capital. And what I saw was it was a matter of 2 factors: alignment of values and objectives, and transparency. And we'd already seen that earlier through charters starting to ask who the ultimate beneficial owners were. So I was seeing it already in the market. And I think what I wanted to do was take that next step and go from a traditional, rather opaque structure into what I thought was going to be the future of shipping.
And how was the experience? Because your IPO was in 2005. It was one of the first IPOs, I guess. So how was the whole process of educating investors and getting the IPO off the block?
So that was for those of you that were around back then, that was a pretty interesting time. What is the Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times? Those were interesting times. What a lot of people don't realize, I think because 2005 was almost that first class of shipping IPOs in the US, and as you all may remember, that was not the first linkage of shipping to the capital markets. There was a whole bond market where shipping companies were offering shipping bonds before the equity markets. I think what a lot of people don't realize about Eagle Bulk specifically, it was never, ever, ever built to be a arbitrage, private to public flip, if you will. The goal was build a world-class shipping company that we never anticipated a capital markets opportunity, because I founded the company literally, I think 6 months before I think about 8 months before the IPO. So if you can imagine that, start the company, want to build it out for a few years, and what happened was, I think dry ships came public first, then Navios came public, and then I was approached by quite a few investment banks who said, listen, you're a New Yorker, you're a shipping company.
How many ships did you have at that time?
At the time, we had about 10 or 11. So by today's scale, couldn't really do an IPO with a fleet that size. But they knocked on the door and they said, listen, you're on Madison Avenue. There's a real appetite. Would you consider doing this? And we looked at it as, and this is what I want, I mean, if anyone is considering or looking at the capital market, specifically in the US, as a pathway, what I would say to people is the IPO is almost the beginning or the process to get to your ultimate goal. It's not the finish line, it's actually the starting line in many cases. So for me, it just allowed us to build out the company faster than if we had been doing it with private capital.
And thinking about that period, you said, okay, there was probably George Economou went first, and Frangu, maybe yourself, another one or two more.
I think Genco was after us. Yeah.
Okay. But I mean, during that period, 2004, 2000, I think it's fair to say, in looking back now, that some companies who became public perhaps weren't the right caliber and it should never have happened. So, I mean, as a general view of that whole period, 2004, 2008, I mean, what can you sort of say to us, what lessons were learned?
So a little bit, the thought that comes to mind is it was a little bit like the Wild West. There was tremendous optimism, tremendous opportunity. And we saw a whole wave of IPOs. I think if I was to bifurcate it, there were two different groups. I think there were the groups that looked at this a little bit like I did, as an opportunity to use the capital markets in an investor-friendly, aligned way to get to where you wanted to go faster. But I think there were some others who looked at it as a sort of a pot of gold, and let me do this to, you know, get to the pot. Yeah. And that's where I think people ran afoul, because they didn't fully appreciate the requirements for disclosure and transparency in the SEC filings you had to do. And so that's how I would characterize it, Kevin. It was an interesting time.
Yep. And then during that time also, you told me last night when we were discussing that you kind of you came to hear about, and you kind of identified eco as the next thing, and you made some strides there as well, didn't you?
Yes. So I know I built the first generation eco ship in China because, and I had Lloyd's Register actually classified like that, and it was well documented. But I believe, and don't quote me on this, I believe I was the first ship owner to build a 100% fully eco fleet about 14 years ago, if you can believe that. So now these were not eco ships the way we discussed eco today, or in the panels earlier today, or part of the Poseidon principles that we've all been discussing and focused on. These were first-gen vessels. And I remember sitting in some technical meetings where the engineers were saying, wow, there's some new technology out there where we can save about 3.5 tons a day or 4 tons a day, mostly with retrofits. And they were looking at it from a purely technical perspective, and I looked at it and I said, there's real commercial value in this. And if I can build a fleet of these ships that is more economical than others, there's an ESG component that is obviously very positive, but there's a commercial component. And there we get back to that same thing, alignment, right? You had an alignment of the economic interests of the ship owner with the alignment of what was good for the environment.
Okay. And then in 2015, you left Eagle Bulk, and since then you've run Zenith Shipping, a private shipping company. So you've been private, public, private. What's the main difference?
So having sort of seen it all, as they say, my takeaway from my personal experience, there is no right answer. There is no wrong answer. There is the right time to do something, the wrong time to do something. I think the capital markets open and close, and sometimes they trade above NAV, sometimes below NAV. So you have to sort of look at it that way. There's, as I said earlier, the capital markets for me allowed me to get to where I wanted to go faster and better. But on the flip side, being private now has had its own advantages. I mean, I ended up building up a fleet of ships when I was buying about 5-6 years ago at the bottom of the market, mostly bulkers. And being private allowed me the flexibility to transact in the market without people sort of knowing what I was doing, because I thought if people knew I was buying, a lot of sellers would then ask more money when they saw me coming. So there are benefits to being private and there are benefits to being public, and I've seen both.
And now, as a private ship owner, you are a fan of diversification. Is that correct?
Yes, I am. I've actually, unbeknownst to me at the time, I mean, I obviously, my grandfather years ago had been in tankers and bulkers, but being in product, crude, and dry specifically, and then later containers, has really been helpful for me in the last two unforeseen sort of black swan events, one being the pandemic and two being the war. And as we all know, especially with dry bulk and with tankers, they've sort of very nicely sort of counterbalanced each other. So to answer your question, I am a fan of diversification.
Okay, thank you. Now, a wee while ago, we heard a panel about decarbonization and all that effort that's going into shipping. Shortly after this, in fact, we're going to hear about the Poseidon Principles. So, do you run your current business conscious of these issues? Is it a very big part of your decision-making process?
So my view on well, as I said, as we all discussed a few moments ago, I'm a big believer in this, and put your money where your mouth is. I built a fleet of 100% first-gen eco vessels. I think it's the socially responsible thing to do. There's political push that way. We as an industry should be ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. We should be early adopters, not late adopters. However, I think if you parse together all the comments we've heard, the takeaway is, at the 30,000-foot view, is we are still an industry in transition, right? We're still looking at different fuel systems. There's a technological overlay. There's regulatory issues that have to be worked out. There are decisions over, if you have two sister ships, one's doing long haul and one's doing short haul, how are they treated differently, even though they're the same? Is that fair? So my personal view is we're in an industry in transition right now. We're all moving the right way. I feel optimistic about 2050, but I think you have to embrace it. It's like ISM in the 90s. I don't know if you guys remember, but when ISM came in and you had classification societies that were going to give certificates for ship owners to trade based on transparent management systems, I remember 90% of ship owners were saying, this is crazy, this is going to destroy our business. And I ran to it. I said, this is like the best thing ever. I said, we're going to have to spend a few more dollars. We're going to have to systematize to make it comply with the new system. But if you embrace this, that's a competitive advantage. So I feel the same way about decarbonization. You got to be on with this program. You really do.
Mm-hmm. And now with the some of the investments you make anyway, you're involved with private equity. So I guess you're having those discussions with them as well. And there's a lot of push from them as well in terms of doing the right thing and being correct in your operational business.
I would say push from them, but push from me. I think to be a good steward of capital, you really, especially as someone who's done this for decades, it shouldn't be your institutional partners telling you that. It should be you driving the process, saying, hey guys, this is what we should do, and this is the way to do it.
Okay, so you've done a lot over 30 years. Let's find out what the highlight was, and perhaps the low point as well. Highlight and low point.
You always got to look at the high and the low, right? So I would say, not to be flip, the highlight has yet to happen, right? Because I'm an inherently restless person. I'm probably my biggest critic. I'm always saying, how could I have done it better? But I will say, Kevin, I've been fortunate enough to have what I call, not highlights, but a couple celebrations along the way. You know, Eagle, like my goal to build, I think at the time, the top middle-sized bulk carrier fleet in the world. Yep. I achieved that. That was a big celebration. Giving a return to my investors, that was another celebration. Focusing on ESG issues 15 years ago, that was a celebration. Another thing that gave me tremendous pleasure, which I don't think any of you in the room may know, I believe I was the first ship owner to, from a blank sheet of paper, find an underwriter circa 2006 to give me fleet-wide charters default insurance. Yeah. Which, whenever someone says to me it can't be done or has never been done before, it's like music to my ears. So did that, disclosed that at Eagle. Lehman Brothers happens. Capes go from $80,000 to $4,500 a day in about 40 days. We had, at the time, I remember we had some Supermaxes, and this, you guys will find this interesting. On 1-year charters, I remember one at $61,000 a day for a 52,000 tonner, and one at $56,000 a day for, I think, a 56,000 tonner. We had at Eagle Bulk during that time 0 defaults, partly because of this product. So again, I would say highlight yet to be done, but many celebrations along the way.
Was there a low point?
The low points were usually events exogenous to our market. So the collapse of the banking system was a low point. When I would talk to end users, and what was interesting about that period, there was demand to move cargoes, but the complaints I heard is we can't get letters of credit because the banks won't issue them. That was a low point. Having to restructure my company was both a low point and a high point. Low point because it took a lot of work. High point because Eagle today is flourishing and is still public, and I never let go of anyone who didn't need to, didn't sell an asset because I had to. So it was both a high point and a low point, but those were challenging times.
Perfect. Final question then. You were able to see ahead in terms of institutional finance coming into shipping. You seem to be able to see the eco thing coming before others. What's next? I mean, is there something on the horizon that interests you about opportunities?
I have to keep my crystal ball a little bit uniquely just to me. What I will share with the group is I think the definition of a ship owner is changing. You know, the term ship owner, are you a ship owner? It connotes the old way of owning ships, operating ships, buying low, selling high, chartering them in an intervening period. I think that definition is changing rapidly. In terms of me, I think it's investing across multiple asset classes, but also up and down the capital structure. So everything from equity to preferred to mezzanine to senior secured, and looking ultimately laterally and not in the traditional sense. So you want to use a Wayne Gretzky term, if you're hockey players, skate to where the puck's going, not to where it is.
Yep. Great. Soph, it's a pleasure having you in London. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good to see everyone.